Let's take on an age-old debate in our last example, which I call faith versus works is dead. This is an illustration of Scripture explaining Scripture using multiple passages from different places in the Bible, including multiple authors. So this will be a very, very brief look at the divergent doctrines of salvation by faith alone versus salvation by faith plus works. The idea that doing good deeds is necessary for salvation versus salvation being a completely unearned gift received only by faith. Instead of using the archaic term works, I'll be using the word actions, which is what the concept of works means in today's English. So the idea that good actions are necessary for salvation basically starts with Yaakov, Jacob, or James, when he poses the question in chapter 2, verse 14, "What is the profit, my brothers, if anyone speaks of having faith, but he does not have actions? Is that faith able to save him?" So in this verse, Yaakov appears to be questioning the value of faith without the actions that flow from that faith, and whether it leads to salvation. Then he proceeds to answer his own question, continuing in verse 15. "If a brother or sister is naked and lacking of the daily food, and any one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warmed, and be filled,' but gives not to them the things needful for the body, what is the profit to that person's life? So also the faith by itself, if it does not have actions, is dead." So this is Yaakov's point, that our faith in Messiah should result in actions, such as taking care of the needs of others, rather than just saying, "I'll pray for you," and then wishing them well. His answer is that faith by itself, without the actions that go with it, is dead. In other words, an inactive faith doesn't save. And he goes on to offer evidence to this effect, beginning in verse 21. Abraham, our father, was he not declared righteous by actions, having brought up Yitzchak, Isaac, his son, upon the altar? Do you see that the faith was working with his actions, and by the actions the faith was perfected? And fulfilled was the scripture that is saying, "And Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him, to righteousness." You see then that by actions is man declared righteous, and not by faith only. Faith apart from actions is dead. So this is important because Yaakov has shifted a little, and now he's speaking about being declared righteous, or in archaic terms, being justified. Being declared righteous isn't identical with salvation, but related, because it has to do with our standing before God and how we'll be judged by him. So we need to be declared righteous in order to be saved. So Yaakov here, by invoking Abraham and his faith in action, is saying that it's not only by faith that we're declared righteous, but by our actions. And then he reiterates, faith apart from actions is dead. This is his main point. So all that seems pretty reasonable and not all that controversial until we stumble upon Paul in Romans chapter 3, verse 28, where he says, "For we consider a man to be declared righteous by faith apart from actions of Torah." And now we're in the thick of it. We just heard Yaakov say that by actions is man declared righteous and not by faith only, so faith plus actions. But here, Paul says, we consider a man to be declared righteous by faith apart from actions, faith alone. And this is why there are two camps on this issue. So now we need to start seeing some scripture explaining scripture, because at this point, we have two hopelessly contradictory assertions. Let's start by letting Paul flesh out his thoughts a little more. Now, as if Paul's statement wasn't enough to upset the apple cart, he also uses Abraham to make his point, using the same scripture that Yaakov used. In Romans 4:2, he says, "For if Abraham was declared righteous by actions, then he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? And Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him to righteousness." So both Yaakov and Paul use the exact same scripture, Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, but appear to be drawing the exact opposite conclusions. Yaakov says that Abraham was declared righteous by his actions, and Paul implies that he wasn't, but instead by faith. As the scripture says, Abraham believed God and righteousness was credited to him. Now, wait a minute. The verse they're both using to make their apparently opposing points says only one thing, that it was because of Abraham's belief or faith that God credited righteousness to him. How can Yaakov then claim it was by actions? Why would Yaakov use a verse to support his point that clearly doesn't? The answer is because neither Yaakov nor Paul are trying to make a point about salvation. They're both making different and separate points about actions. And here's where Scripture explaining Scripture is so important, because Yaakov and Paul don't actually disagree about how our actions affect our declared righteousness. As we see earlier in Romans in chapter 2, verse 13, Paul literally says that it is not the hearers of Torah who are righteous before God, but the doers of Torah who will be declared righteous. The context of Paul's entire discussion in Romans about faith versus actions is that it's aimed at Jewish believers who are doing the Torah legalistically in order to be declared righteous, which Paul flatly condemns throughout his writings. But that doesn't negate the doing of the Torah itself, which, when done in faith, in other words, with the right heart, does declare the doer righteous, as he says in chapter 2. By contrast, Yaakov's discussion isn't about Torah keeping, but about having common sense decency and helping people. And that if we have a faith in Messiah that is alive, it will make itself evident through our actions. His goal isn't to make a commentary on true faith and whether or not it brings salvation without actions. He's saying that if we have a faith that doesn't result in actions, then it's not a living faith, but a dead one. In other words, Yaakov and Paul are both discussing faith, actions, declared righteousness, and to some extent, salvation. But their main points are completely different. They're not arguing with each other about salvation and defending opposing opinions. They're making two different points with two separate audiences. So in a very real way, the disagreement over salvation by faith only versus salvation by faith plus actions is somewhat manufactured. Because when we continue to use Scripture to explain Scripture, we find a very clear statement about how we are saved and what roles faith and actions play in relation to that salvation. Paul explains it to us in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 9. For by unmerited favor or grace you are having been saved through faith, and this not of something you did. It is the gift of God, not of your actions, so that no one may boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Messiah Yeshua for good actions, which God prepared beforehand so that in them we may walk. This scripture by Paul explains and puts into fuller perspective Yaakov's declaration that faith without actions is dead. Salvation is through faith. We aren't saved because of the things we do. Because if salvation weren't a free gift from God, then we would be able to boast. And given who Paul is specifically addressing at this point in Romans, it's worth noting that the prophet says to Judah in Isaiah 64:6, and we were as unclean, all of us, and all our righteous acts as a menstruation garment. So this very visual illustration from Isaiah about righteous acts adds another biblical voice to the explanation. So the scriptures in Romans and Ephesians and Isaiah then explain the scripture in Yaakov. And when we consider all these passages together, what we find is that we're saved by God's grace, by his showing us favor that we didn't earn, which is through faith and not at all a result of our actions. However, in that faith, we have been recreated in the Messiah Yeshua for what? For good actions. Out of our faith should flow the good actions that back it up, that demonstrate our faith in Messiah in the things we do. So when we say we have faith, but don't have the actions that go with them, then we have a faith that doesn't save, because that faith isn't true or real or alive. A living faith in the Messiah must result in real actions. We're saved by faith apart from our actions, but our actions, or lack of actions, demonstrate the kind of faith we truly